Hi, welcome back to another episode of the Keto Naturopath on YouTube. And I would like to start this episode a little bit different than all the others and just get something off my chest. I'm going to rant a little bit, and I hope I'm not condescending to anybody else, but I just want to tell you a problem that I've had for really a couple decades, and I'm finally finding an answer to that. It's really a story of that little voice in the back of your head that won't go away. And then half of you says, well, it's just a little thing. Don't worry about it. You know, nobody else is paying attention to it, so why should you? Okay, so what is that thing? It has to do with the whole omega panel. For 20 plus years that I've been doing omega panels with other labs, of course. But there was consistently high omega-6 side. So you had omega-3, it's like a seesaw, omega-3, omega-6. Sorry, yeah, well, whatever. Right? Doesn't really matter here. And so why were they so high in omega-6? I even would send back results and saying, call a lab, is this true? This is the number, absolute number. They would authenticate it for me. They would verify it, and okay, I was good with that. Then I would ask the patient that they'd have to have a 7-day diet diary, so I saw what they had. At that point, they had to, write it longhand. There wasn't an online app like Chronometer or something. So they would redo it. And they're going, well, and it wasn't anything that was critical. In other words, I couldn't say you're critically high in omega-6 and I'm worried about it. It just never, it's not like, hey, you're so low on iron, you need to have a transfusion. Your omega panel doesn't work that way. It doesn't hit a crisis point. It nearly comes to a question point. The question point, why so tilted for omega-6? So I would find that, initially it was, the way I learned it in naturopathic school, it's like you had meat eaters, they're high in omega-6. You had vegetarians, or vegetable eaters, we'll say, not necessarily vegetarians, were higher in omega-3. And that's how it was. That was the total explanation for omega-6 to omega-3. And guess what? I find that that's not true at all, because I would find all these diet diaries that they were not high in meat eating. And when I say meat, chicken, fish even, few people are high in fish consumption, by the way, except those who have tuna, and they have a whole other problem. Anyway, so that really wasn't true. So I just let it go, saying, it's not an issue anybody else is talking about. But actually, it is critical. It is absolutely critical. So today's episode is going into what I consider really the ultimate keto lie. Why do I call it a keto lie? You could say protein-sparing modified fast as well, but it's not so much that. It's mostly about keto. Because when you go to these keto conferences, they talk about adding fat, add fat, put it on. And you even had, as I mentioned before, Dr. Finney comes out with a jug of coconut oil, don't you wish, a jug of canola oil. And I just said, it's that little voice in the back of my head. I kind of don't agree with it, but then again, I'm the one who missed the whole drop the carbs from your diet and your gut will get better. So if I miss that, I was then open to all these other things that I could possibly miss. But this just wouldn't go away. Why would other people saying, don't worry about it? And gradually it came to, certainly there's a carnivore movement, right? And there's a ketovore movement. But it was bigger than that. Something had to justify, why are these people, and we'll get to my labs in the end, so you'll see real people, why are they so outrageously high, and why is this causing so much problem for them? All right, that's my rant up front. We'll get back with the talk. Bye. Okay, then let's get started. Perhaps I'm a little bit too passionate about this, but you have a big secret coming up that you're going to find very useful to go over. So I call this the ultimate big fat lie. This is the one that you can discover it and you can do something about it and it will change your life, okay? Pretty straightforward. It's just not information that, hey, isn't that interesting? It's a controversy if you're very conservative and been living under a rock for the last 60 years, 70 years actually. And, but other than that, this is something you can do. By the end of the week, you'll have your own data, I hope. So the goal is to make you a student of your own lab. This is kind of like everything I do. Here's the information. Now go use this. This will immediately change what you're doing. And it's not so much, hey, eat this fruit versus that, or this meat versus that, and so on. No, it's about, let's get about the data. If we're on the data, we can have an intelligent conversation with each other. Okay? You with me? Good. All right. What I want to show you is how the right lab work can make a tremendous difference in your health, your weight goals, physique, mental clarity, psychological well-being, etc. So that's going to be part of this. Okay, why these labs will help you lose weight dramatically, should you need to. The combination of the data from these labs will show you what to address for your weight loss or your weight ideal, whatever it is, and how the food industry has been keeping this secret from you. It's the story of the Sydney Heart Health Study, but it's also another study that's in here coming up. It was just an amazing story. Okay, 5 labs you can do. Let's get this out of the way first, and I'm going to end up with this. So first it's setting up the structure, and then we're going to show you how a lot of people have performed on this and why it's relevant and be relevant for you. Okay, so first what are these 5 labs? Triglycerides, HDL, insulin, and glucose. And I did a whole separate video just on these 4, saying 4 labs you should do. This is really about your metabolic health and putting it into a square here. We'll look at this, but also add to the omega panel that I've been talking to you about, right? And you need to find out about your linoleic acid, your omega-3 and linoleic acid. Say it's 16 times fast versus your omega-3. And while I'm pointing to this, I'm going to say the same thing 10 different times to get used to it, is that you can't just dump in one side of the equation. You can't have fish oil and eat crap and be good. That will probably be a better thing than not doing that. But if you're never going to change how you're eating and think you can be taking supplements, the right supplement's going to help you, they'll help a little bit, but inevitably you will be making a problem. So in other words, at some point you got to weed your garden, for another analogy. So how much will all of these tests cost collectively? Let's get that out of the way. I did this before. This is your these 4 tests, which are not just your lipid panel, by the way. This is insulin, glucose, fasting insulin, fasting glucose, fasting HDL cholesterol, fasting triglycerides. So when I calculated that number, it was through my portal, through what they call Ulta Lab Test, which is kind of a retail end for Quest. And here's the labs for that. So if you go through my portal, it's moderately cheaper. I don't get a penny out of it. So I'm not even pitching Ulta Lab. I'm showing you what I use and where you can get this. The only reason I know this is somebody did this after that video and said, it's not as cheap as you showed us on this video. It's $35 versus $26. So for what it's worth, there you go. That's how you get there, and that's how you do it. And you find out the only 2 states are going to have a problem with this is New York and New Jersey. Other than that, all the other states are good. All right, and the omega panel. This is all the things. We're going to get into it. So the omega-3 6 ratio, that's really important. We're going to be killing that today. The omega index, omega-3 index, is basically weighing your EPA versus DHA. So it's strictly omega-3. Then you can go on for some others. They're all worthwhile, but it's really just the top 1, the top 2 that I'm really going to be focusing on today. What will they show us? They can determine whether you're insulin resistant or not, if you have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or not, and if you are overweight because you have been eating the wrong kind of fat. And we sort of talked about that in the last video, that has made you overweight. So what you really need to do, if somebody's having a full academic conversation, they say, well, we need to do a liver panel to determine if I have fatty liver. Of course, that is this. But this test, just looking at these fats, are going to show you that something is wrong. You can follow it up. So I'm just giving you the skinny. I'm giving you the poor man's liver panel, if you will. Where do we go to get these tests? We go to Ulta Lab, which you go online, which I just showed you. Okay, 4 labs you should get. These are those 4. This is basically what they look like. We're going to come back to all this, so I'm not going to go over each one right now, but these are important. So these are the 4 labs: triglycerides, HDL, insulin, glucose. From that, we can determine your insulin resistance, which is what this is here. We can do another test which sort of gives an idea of insulin resistance, which is called triglycerides over glucose. There's a little formula for that. Then you have triglycerides over HDL. That's a good one as well. So we have 3 different ways we can look at your metabolic health. So it's not just about insulin resistance, but they're pretty much the same issue. And so now we can box people in by saying, here we got 3 tests. This shows you're terrible on this one. And it really gives you a parameter so people can buck up to believe what we're talking about, and then they'll have something to do. Okay, so ordinarily, if you just go to your doctor, you just get glucose, fasting glucose. And so by this level alone, only 2 people would be considered high, 179 This is fasting glucose, and 201. You go, oh, it's fairly high for fasting. Ideally, fasting should be anywhere between 75 and 85. But 113, and nobody, a doctor's going to say, well, you should probably work on getting this down. You're not in the trouble zone yet. Same with the 117. But when you then bring in fasting insulin, which nearly no doctors do, you're going to go, holy cow, this guy has a problem, or this woman has a problem. Right across, look at this, 52 for an insulin. They are just out of control. And when you deal with somebody who's this high, they just tend not to listen and think, oh, well, I'm already screwed, so I'll just eat more potato chips. So you have to watch how you deliver the information and give them something that they can do inch by inch, assuming they're interested in changing their lives. A lot of people aren't. Not everybody wants to stop smoking simply because it's dangerous, believe it or not. All right, back to your omega-6 linoleic acid or obesity oil or hibernation oil panel. That's what we're looking at. We're going to focus on this and that and talk about some of these others, but these two I'm trying to repeat so you know, you come out of this video almost as a mantra. All right, I get those 4 labs for my metabolic health and I get my omega panel. Then it costs you about $60 combined. And this is what that will look like. I want to just give you a quick bird's eye view. And these are just random people. I just sliced off a piece of our spreadsheet and said, here you go. Those who had the highest, which I put blue boxes around, clearly have an issue down here, but look at, as you come down, we'll put that into a larger context. All right, so that's the context of omega-6 and your cardiovascular health, your metabolic health, right? We're doing this again, omega-6 linoleic acid, and this is the side we're talking about. Now, my problem was this. For 25 years, I couldn't believe that people could actually be this high. You know, I came from a school that taught you that basically if the meat eaters to one side are going to have a high omega-6 and they'll be pro-inflammatory, and the vegetarians or nearly vegetarians are not, and they're going to be at the other side. They're going to have low inflammation. And that was it, left or right, omega-6 or omega-3 kind of thing. I just couldn't, you know, it's like, how much meat do you have to eat to have an omega-6 up to 17.2 or 10 even, or 17.8? There's some high numbers here, and I've seen that again and again. It just never really settled with me, like, really, you eat that much meat? No, they didn't. They came in and I saw their diet diary, asked them to do it again. I did double checks, and they go, I didn't see that. What was I missing then? What was I missing then? Well, here's where we get, here's all the natural sources for omega-6. We talked a lot about this last video, but I want to show you all these oils up here: safflower, sunflower, corn, wheat germ, cottonseed, soy, walnut oil, sesame seed oil, peanut oil, canola oil. Pretty much everything above this line is used as vegetable oil. It's what restaurants use to cook your food in. And it's also obviously used in processed food. So your potato chips, your cereals, your anything there. So all of this, you are getting that primarily. And here's the answer, is that through these oils in processed food, let alone the process of the whole oxidation, that's a whole nother level of problem. But we're just talking about how can we account for so much omega-6? It's processed foods in your diet. There's the answer, pretty sweet. But wait. That's not the end of it. That's the reality I presented to you, okay? That's the reality for all of us. What's the story? Well, you remember Ansel Keys in the late 50s, University of Minnesota. He was all about he was Time Man of the Year in 1961, January 13th. Well, his theory was that saturated fats were bad. You have too many saturated fats, which came from, according to him, animal fats, milk, and that was pretty much it, led to elevated cholesterol, led to heart attacks. The 1950s was a big heart attack fear decade because of Eisenhower's 3 or 4 heart attacks he had while in office. All right, well, guess what? He's back again in the late 60s, so a decade later. He got involved as the kind of the co-lead again, the University of Minnesota, and this was called the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. The Minnesota Coronary Experiment, otherwise known as MCE. So whereas before he faked the results for the 7-country study, how did he fake the results? He wanted that correlation between saturated fats and heart disease. So he simply removed 40 some odd countries data and left just 7. So he called it the 7-country study. How convenient, you just lop off what doesn't agree with your hypothesis. Well, guess what? He got caught again, but he was dead by the time they realized this is what happened. He wasn't the lead, he was the co-lead. I said, but wait, there's a story you have to hear. All right, so what they did in this other study that was the Minnesota Coronary Survey or Experiment was 4.5-year study of men and women in which they controlled their diet. They managed to pull out of their diet saturated fats, and they gave them corn oil primarily. They gave them vegetable oil. Pretty interesting, huh? They gave them vegetable oil, polyunsaturated, because saturated fats are bad, and they wanted to show, and 4 to 5 ended up being 7 years total, that there again, there was a correlation of saturated fats to heart disease. Guess what? A lot of the data kind of just disappeared. And so, again, removing that data, they were left with not great conclusions, but nothing bad. So the conclusion, and this is now of 1989, and I'll show you the timeline of why this is 1989 and not the late 70s, is this showed that the entire study population, no differences between treatment and control groups were observed for cardiovascular events, cardiovascular deaths, and total mortality. A favorable trend for all these endpoints occurred with younger age groups. So basically all this, and this was the largest study ever done in history at that point. Oh yeah, really? Nothing happened. Well, 45 years after these studies were completed, there was missing data that was discovered, and that changed the entire picture. So in 1913, the same study, just like was set up in Sydney, Australia, also in the 60s into the 70s. And so now they discovered first missing data from that one as well. It was in somebody's garage, believe it or not. It's still kept and brought forward and then reanalyzed 40 some odd years later and came with a different perspective, a different conclusion. This was covered on the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting News, saying, heart healthy claims reconsidered. Oops. And this was their broadcast as well. The case of the missing data. Scientists have always reported, basically saying that somehow this was missed, it was found, and it now changes the study was supposed to have been wrapped up in 1973, but all of this came back out and they had to put it back together and it's a whole different study. And then 3 years later, it happened again. The Minnesota Coronary Experiment also was discovered that there was boxes and boxes, actually it was magnetic tapes in that case, boxes and boxes of magnetic tapes that had the data on it that had been unaccounted for. Here's Scientific American saying, records found in dusty basement undermine decades of dietary advice. Raw data from a 40-year-old study raises new questions about fats. Then this in the New York Times, this is 2016, so this is about the Minnesota. A great article, by the way. So the New York Times, looked that up, April 13th, 2016, and it basically said, Charles E. Ramsden. And you go, who is he? Interesting story. He's still around, and we'll get to him in a second. But basically, the summary Dr. Ramsden stressed the team's findings should be interpreted cautiously. So he's not saying, it's all bunk. But jumping down to below, they're saying, research underscores the science behind the dietary fat may be more complex than nutritional recommendations suggest. A century ago, it was common for Americans to get about 2% of their diet calories from linoleic acid, omega-6, right? 2% of their calories came from linoleic acid, 2%. Americans, on average, consume more than triple that amount, most of it from lunch meats, salad dressings, desserts, pizza, French fries, packaged snacks like potato chips. More natural sources of fats such as olive oil, butter, and eggs, contain linoleic acid as well, but in much smaller quantities, as you saw by that list. So eating whole, unprocessed foods and plants may be one way of getting all the linoleic acid your body needs. In other words, 100 years ago, all we had were veggies, and yes, there was some omega-6 in that, but it wasn't much. And the meats he left out. Okay, seriously, they just forgot to include this data? Let's look at the timeline. So here's the timeline. Here's the American Heart Association issues advice to replace saturated fats, right? So that's the Ansel Keys thing. And he was Man of the Year in '61, remember? Animal fats with polyunsaturated fats like vegetable fats. Time goes by. This is now the Sydney Heart Health, the Sydney Diet Heart Study completed. And here's the Minnesota Coronary Experiment completed in the early '70s. Then partial results were released, presented at the American Heart Association in the late '70s. Partial, non-cardiovascular Sydney data was published in the late '70s. And then more partial of the Minnesota Coronary Experiment published in the early '80s in somebody's master thesis. Now everything's quiet, right? Now everything's quiet. You got all this data out there, and people are believing, oh my gosh, saturated fats, out with saturated fats, and bring in the vegetable oil, bring in the Crisco, bring in the whatever the name is. And that's what was happening. Then, a little later even, the partial Minnesota Coronary Experiment results published and no particular statistics. Then we go 40 years later, publication of missing Sydney Health Survey data in the British Medical Journal. And then 3 years later, publication of the missing Minnesota Coronary Experiment in the British Medical Journal. Now what's interesting is that Dr. Ramsden, who actually was trained in rehabilitative medicine, which is interesting, it was my dad's specialty, and he was working at the NIH. So why would the NIH publish something in the British Medical Journal in the 2013 and 16? Chances are it would get published then. Chances are in the United States it probably wouldn't be published, is my conclusion. All right, here's the man. Dr. Christopher, I said Charles, Dr. Christopher Ramsden, MD. So he's an investigator, and he wasn't fired, and he wasn't killed, and he still exists. It's amazing. So these are these two studies. So this was the reevaluation of the traditional diet heart hypothesis analysis of recovered data from the Minnesota Coronary Experiment, 68 to 73, so that's 5 years. And then the use of dietary linoleic acid for secondary prevention of coronary heart disease and death, evaluation of recovered data from the Sydney Diet Heart Study, and updated meta-analysis. So they redid it. He redid all these and said, that doesn't go together. So what were his conclusions? To be simple about it. Here's what it looked like. Here's when the British Medical Journal, right? What I just read you. So this is on the first one is 2013. So that's the Sydney Diet Heart Study. 66 to 73. The other was 68 to 73. This is all who was in it. I'm not going to read you that, but basically let's get to the conclusion. And it says, the clinical benefits of the most abundant polyunsaturated fatty acid, omega-6, linoleic acid, have not been established in this cohort. Substituting dietary linoleic acid in place of saturated fats increased the rates of all causes, coronary heart disease, cardiovascular disease. An updated meta-analysis of linoleic acid intervention trials showed no evidence of cardiovascular benefits. Linoleic acid is bad news, Now we're getting to it, Here's the other conclusion 3 years later of the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. Now what's he saying here? Shows that the replacement of saturated fat in the diet with linoleic acid effectively lowers serum cholesterol, but does not support the hypothesis that this translates into a lower risk of death from coronary heart disease of all causes. So these two studies that were the biggest ever done in history to date had chunks of data missing that were discovered 45 years later out of the basement in somebody's garage. Okay then, so what's the overall summary? All right, So that's the Minnesota Coronary Experiment's finding adds to growing evidence that the incomplete publication has contributed to the overestimation of benefits and underestimation of potential risks of replacing saturated fats with vegetable oils and linoleic acid. In other words, giving linoleic acid causes all sorts of metabolic problems, death, heart disease, etc. Okay, now let's go back and look at the labs. Let's look at these labs to see if there's a pattern. Let's look at real people. Let's get some data here, okay? Okay, here we go. Here's the omega-6 panel I showed you before, and what I did, I simply took the spreadsheet. That's why it's important to get data on a spreadsheet, because you can see the relationships quickly. You can move them around. So I simply lined it up with the highest of this group of people. I just simply took off a row of people that we had in the spreadsheet, in the first page of the spreadsheet, the database, I should say. So we're looking at, everything is lined up from the highest omega-6 of all these labs. So we have 17.2, 17.8, 17.5, 14, so they're all really high. So it's really high omega-6. That means, to be real specific, this is almost 18 times the amount of, 18 times more linoleic acid, omega-6, than there is omega-3. So that's 18 to 1 ratio. And so what we see is their inflammatory risk is there, and I also put in CRP in the end so you can sort of see it corresponds. On the omega panel, they simply give you a risk factor of high, medium, or low. I threw in CRP to see what that would look like, and clearly it correlates. All right, so what else can we look at? Now let's look at those 4 labs I've told you about, right? So we're going to look at your metabolic health, your cardiovascular health, those 4 labs that we did the other video on. So we have triglycerides, HDL, insulin, and glucose. So okay, this is what these look like. All right, just going through, say, this is what these look like. Looks like they're all kind of not doing well. Let's put them together. Boom. So these are all the same people. Again, at the top, they are all keyed in. This is the highest to the lowest of the very top of the omega-6. What do we find? High inflammation. What do we find for insulin? Look at the insulin. 26. You know what? Insulin should be around 2 or 3. 26, 16, 52. It's fasting. Their glucose, you could argue it's high normal. That's high normal and high in the middle. What else do we have? Their triglycerides were, one was fair. They were all high. Their triglyceride glucose. So what we say, look at all the red. As I've said before, high inflammation, high metabolic problems, high cardiovascular problems. And what's the number one correlation? You usually don't find things like this. So my little voice in the back of my head saying, how can this be that so many people are high in omega-6? It's that this is why. It's all that processed food. It's all those other oils we're using, hopefully not at home. So one thing, which is worth saying, when I would start coaching with people with keto back 3 or 4 years ago, the first thing we'd ask them to do is go through and get all the carbohydrates, the cookies, the cereals, the grains, put them in a bag and take it out, put it in their, if they have another freezer, put it in the freezer, put it in the garage, put it in the basement, but get it out of the kitchen. Not just get it out of your sight, but get it out of the kitchen. Right now, I would add, you're going to get all your vegetable oils and all your processed oils, your canola oils, corn oils, soy oils, peanut, all that out. So that's equally important in my mind, is to get these processed oils, these vegetable oils, these seed oils out of the kitchen, carbohydrates, those processed foods out of the kitchen. Okay, so now we see there's a strong correlation. Look at this. The highest insulin resistance is actually this guy here. He had 17.5. They're all pretty much neck and neck. Hey, 17.5, 6.5, 7.5, 6. What else can we say? Look at their insulin. 26. I said that before. Glucose. I'd say there's almost a perfect correlation. Now let's throw in other labs. Here's the bigger picture. Not other labs, but now other people. I took that rest of the database and I spread them down, leading by the highest to the lowest. And really what's interesting, really interesting, this is why all doctors should put their data on a spreadsheet, because they're going to see this. Remember we talked about how total cholesterol is a bunch of bunk? And I could have done LDL. But what I did is that here's the highest. We have the highest inflammation. Look at this, CRP. Highest inflammation on the left side and lowest inflammation on the right side. And the only thing we're correlating is omega-6. Now let's look at cholesterol. The cholesterol is lowest on the left side for these people that have high inflammation and it's highest on those who have low inflammation. How can you figure that out? Well, actually, that's been studied now for 15 years in Scandinavia. It's just never been recognized in this country by the institutes that recognize it, the insurance companies, the pharmaceutical companies, etc., because they're very much invested in statins. Okay, that's pretty much all I want you to know. Omega-6, you really need to take care of it. You can test for it. You now know where you can find it. You now know how it's coming into your life. Address it. So the omega-6 that is in meat, poultry, and fish is minor relative to processed foods. You could argue with me the pork and the chicken because they're factory farmed. Well, if you can find another source, that's going to change that variable by a lot. But that is what it is. But those are small pickings relative to dealing with the big thing. Take care. Till next time. Bye-bye.